Every year, dozens, if not hundreds of people go missing in the forests of North America. And today's story might just shed a little bit of light as to where they're going. In Southeast Ohio, there is now an abandoned Girl Scout camp deep in the forest, miles from nowhere special, with nothing but cornfields and cows as far as the eye can see. Very few people even know that it's there, and even fewer people know why it was closed. But Jamie does. In the summer of 1970, Jamie is a scrawny little tomboy, far away from the sweet, innocent little girl with the pink ribbons. She was wild and dirty with unbrushed hair who spent most of her time in the forest running, which is why she was usually covered from head to toe in scratches and bruises. She knew no fear and was game for anything, which is why when the time came for another Girl Scout camping trip, Jamie and her best friend Tracy signed up immediately. It was a bit like boot camp, with Patty, the leader, committed to the girls' education of the wild, as well as nurturing Jamie and the other girls to be independent young ladies. And Patty's first rule during camping was that every girl had to carry their own equipment to the campsite themselves, starting from the parking field. And Jamie's pretty sure that Patty did this to kind of weed out the girly girls and deter them from returning next year. It was only 2 miles, but as a 45-pound kid, it felt like 20. So all the girls start marching up the trail. And about halfway up is a big hill. And Jamie sets it as her personal challenge to be the first one to make it to the hill. The other girls usually stop several times while they're whining about their packs and they gotta take a break. And they are supposed to move as a pack. But Jamie keeps walking, determined to conquer that hill. And as she reaches the top, she sees a snake crossing the trail and her eyes gleam with excitement. She was just a little bit mischievous back then. And she immediately sets down her backpack and tiptoes near the snake, then lunges at it, grabbing it by the back of the head like she had done 100 times before. And then she just sits down and admires the snake for a while until she hears the rest of the group coming. She then has this crazy idea of how funny it would be to scare them all back down the hill using the snake. They would all have to climb that hill a second time. That thought alone put a big grin on Jamie's face. Her friend Tracy is the first one to clear the top, and she tries to scare her with the snake, but Tracy just rolled her eyes and said, "You're gonna get bit." But the other girls do not disappoint. Jamie runs up to them with the snake outstretched in her hands, and the girls run and start running back down the hill screaming, "Copperhead! Copperhead!" Sure enough, it was a copperhead. Jamie swears she has never seen Patty so mad as her cheeks turn blaze red. No one gets bit, and once they finally settle down at the camp and Patty's cheeks have returned to their normal color, she hands down Jamie's punishment. First, Jamie has to clean out the outhouse. And second, she has to dig the trenches around the tents. Now, the tents don't have floors. They're just canvas A-frame tents. So if they don't dig trenches around the tents will flood if it rains. So Jamie starts on the first trench, and she gets about 3 feet in when she decides she'd rather go swimming at the nearby falls. Now, the falls are located about a mile from the campsite, and Jamie knows where they are because she's been there several times before. So she cranes her head around, making sure nobody's looking, and when the coast is clear, she sneaks off by herself. Once she gets to the falls, she takes off her shoes and socks and wades into the cool water up to her knees, looks down through the crystal clear water, and picks out some especially round, flat rocks, and proceeds to practice her stone skipping skills. And while she's there counting skips, trying to beat her personal record, she hears a splash behind her, and she jerks her head around, positive Someone must have seen her leaving camp, and now she is busted. But nothing. She stands still and quiet, trying to hear any kind of sound or any kind of movement. As she's scanning her surroundings, there's another splash. This time, it is louder, bigger, closer. Like somebody is trying to throw rocks right at her. And for the first time ever, she feels that prickly feeling that makes you sweat all over. That feeling of being watched by someone or something that you can't see. And Jamie just stands there, statue still, her eyes darting around looking for any movement. She doesn't see anything. She doesn't hear anything. But she does notice that after that second splash, everything has gone completely silent. Now her brain is going 1,000,000 miles a minute. And once her legs have caught up to her brain, she takes off and starts running back to camp, stopping at the very edge to put her shoes and socks back on, and casually strolls back into camp. No one noticed she was gone, and since she didn't want any more trouble, she didn't say anything to anyone about what had just happened to her. And the rest of the day passed without any issue, except that tense sensation of being watched that she just couldn't quite shake. Now the girls are grouped 5 girls to a tent. And since Tracy's mom is one of the chaperones, Tracy is in a different tent with her mom. And Tracy's mom really doesn't like Jamie anyway, because she thinks Jamie's kind of a demon child and she will have none of it. But Jamie isn't really all that bothered by it, because if they had a chaperone in their tent, she wouldn't be able to scare all of the other girls with ghost stories at night. So the girls in her tent stay up giggling and telling scary stories for a while into the night, but eventually they all fall asleep. Now, a few hours later, Jamie is woken up with the feeling of something pushing against her throat and bumping on her chin. And she tries to reach up with her hand, but something is blocking her. And she then realizes that she is freezing and soaking wet. And as the fog of sleep is lifting, her mind catches up to the fact that her head is inside the tent, but the rest of her is not. Somehow, she was pulled out of the tent feet first, but her head was too big to fit under the edge of the tent. And that pressing sensation she felt earlier was the bottom of the tent cutting into her chin and her throat as whoever it was trying to pull her out. So her fingers find a small gap in the bottom of the tent, and she wiggles her body back inside the tent where her head is. And Jamie starts searching all around the tent looking for her sleeping bag, which of course wakes up all the other girls. And she asks for help, but they're all kind of half asleep and they ignore her and just go back to sleep. So she's sitting in the tent, wet and cold and shivering with her teeth chattering, and she just starts to cry, "Patty! Patty!" And finally, Patty comes with a flashlight. And Jamie tells her what happened, and Patty takes the flashlight and looks around all over outside of the tent, but can't find her sleeping bag anywhere. And Patty says, "Is this one of your pranks?" And Jamie says, "No, I swear, I haven't been outside. Look, my hair is still dry." And Patty doesn't quite know what to do. So for the time being, she tells one of the other campers to share her sleeping bag with Jamie, which of course pisses off the other camper because Jamie then climbs inside the sleeping bag, all wet and cold. The next day, everyone gets up early and Patty is gone. But Jane, one of the other troop leaders, is sitting on a stump, chain smoking, visibly upset. But an hour or so later, Patty returns and she says, "Pack it up, girls. It's time to go home." And that is all she would say. So they did. The girls packed up all their gear, hiked back down the hill to their waiting vehicles, and drove back into town. And the confused parents were told that the girls were coming home early because of the storm that they had had the night before. Fast forward to today, and Jamie and Tracy are still best friends. And not too long ago, Jane, the other troop leader, visited Jamie's farm. And in the course of catching up, Jamie mentions something about the woods. And Jane says she's uncomfortable with the woods, which confuses Jamie because she remembers as a kid that Jane loved those camping trips. And Jane says, not anymore. Not since that Girl Scout camping trip. And taken a bit off guard, Jamie's surprised that Jane still remembers that trip. So she asks Jane, well, why? What's so big about that trip? So Jane told her. When she and Patty got up that morning, Patty went to go look for the sleeping bag and found tracks in the mud. They were huge tracks. Definitely not human. And Patty followed those tracks about 3 miles up the mountain, where she found the sleeping bag ripped to shreds. That is why they closed the camp. Now, Jamie says she thinks whoever the owner of those footprints is thought she was sleeping in that sleeping bag. And with the extra weight of the rain making it wet and heavy, it probably felt occupied. One of the very few times Jamie has been thankful for the rain. She believes the creature, or whatever it was, had been watching her from the time she arrived at the camp. It must have followed her to the falls and threw rocks at her. And then it waited until everyone was asleep and tried to take her, sleeping bag and all. And once it got up the mountain and figured out that that sleeping bag was empty, it was pissed. Thankfully, Jamie doesn't let this experience affect her love of the woods. But with this newly acquired little bit of information, she is now just a little bit more cautious. And if your binge bucket is not yet full, go right here. These stories should help. And we will see you again on the In-Between.